Hello, everybody. I am back with Professor Larry Cotta-Backer to discuss his book, Hong Kong Between One Country and Two Systems. Today, we will be discussing Chapter 13, Reflections on Zheng Yongnian's The Capital of Protest, Who Controls Hong Kong. How are you doing today, Professor Backer?
Oh, very well, very well. Thanks for continuing to do this. There are a lot of chapters, but they're getting more interesting, I think.
There are tons of stories to be told. So today we are talking about this article. What or the reflections on this article? What made you want to discuss this book in the book?
Well, it was very interesting. One of the things that I had noticed is we're now getting towards the end of August 2019, um, and this is of course a pretension of culture, especially of culture among the intellectuals. Certainly since the end of the Second World War, is that in these great conceptual battles, intellectuals, and especially public intellectuals, will always have something to say. And a lot of times their interactions may, to some extent, either reflect or jar with the development of the official narrative that's coming from one of the stakeholders, either the state, the vanguard party, large enterprises, or other significant influences or actors, depending on what system you're in. And Hong Kong was no different. And we have academics now beginning to speak. And there's a lot of speaking that tends to mirror the developing official lines. And those are kind of interesting, if only, especially for those who are counting noses, well, I know who all the faculty are. Let me see what they're writing. And if I can figure out what they're writing, then I can put them in one camp or another. But beyond that, they're of fairly little interest, especially in the context of the big issues that are being developed now. But this one was kind of interesting. We'd already looked at one at Professor Shen article. This one was interesting because it really seemed to point to something else that was going on in ways that I hadn't really noticed until then. It was probably going on outside of my notice. But one of the interesting things about the book is the way in which uh, um, your the timing of your ability to extract things can sometimes be very serendipitous. And for me, this moment of, I guess, serendipity leading to some enlightenment. Because here, in contrast to the more magisterial and bridge building sort of um, efforts that we had seen from the from Professor Shen, whose interactions we'd already talked about. Here, you have something that's a little different. And we begin talking here about people and people belonging, about the state. And it's the discussion here ultimately, it picks up this notion of patriotism, and ultimately will be refined by the state, I think, in the full development of the great patriotic campaign and the patriotic line that we see in full flower by May of 2020, at least that by we meaning me on the outside, see by May 2020, and then further develop now. And so for me, this is a particularly interesting moment when that kind of early trajectory is now discernible.
And do you think that this could have been foreseen when you saw the, I guess you say, the other rising and the discussions of the black hand? Was it almost like a setup in volleyball where you're setting up for the spike towards the patriotism argument?
Yeah, that's like it's well. I mean, it used to be Monday
Speculative?
morning. It used to be Monday morning quarterbacking before we had
Okay.
Monday football, right? But it's easy to connect those dots when you go backwards. Right.
Okay.
We're sitting now in 2021 and yeah, oh my God, it's all obvious. Even if it isn't obvious, there's one chapter that's coming up where I talk about Nietzsche's 4 great errors, and one of them is false causes, and one of them is inverting cause and effect. And in this context, it's very easy to fall into that trap. So that's a long way of saying, I have no idea what the reality was. I suspect that there was a combination of convergence, of conversations, of congealing, and of a sense of reading, and to some extent risk reading,
Mm-hmm.
where the conversation was going to go depending on which group you tended to have an affinity for. And
Yeah,
I think this may be one of those cases. Um, it was hard to tell what this meant. At the time, I was already getting, uh, please forgive me, my little spidey sense was going and saying, wait a minute, I've heard this before. And for anyone who spent time reading the founding generation, and especially Mao Zedong, uh, the language starts sounding familiar. And so part of the reason I focused on this, and this is again back in August of 2019, was, well, wait a minute, I've heard this, is this really what's going on? Here's an echo. I wasn't sure. Clearly by May of 2020, the echoes are very strong. And by 2021, with the more robust, the more robust going back, especially among the leaders and the central authorities, to Mao's, to particular avenues of Mao Zedong's thinking, it becomes much clearer. But at the time, it wasn't really clear. People were, even by 2019, a number of us had already seen some of the writing on the wall, and the movement back towards not a rehabilitation, but a re-emphasis on some lines of theoretical Leninism that had been applied in a particular way during the founding period, through the Cultural Revolution, sometimes successfully, sometimes disastrously, but a revivification of that in some way. But applied to Hong Kong, that would have been a stretch, at least in my mind, in 2018 and 2019. But clearly, perhaps setting up the moral, of course, by the end of this and starting here, is that for Westerners who have not cracked open Mao Zedong's thought, and who are interested in China, it probably would behoove them to to revisit Mao the way those who are deeply committed to markets and markets-oriented thinking ought to crack open Adam Smith again from time to time, because there are things that are now coming back in ways, and sometimes in particularly altered ways. And so this is my first engagement with this kind of thinking.
Yeah, I guess you would say the smartest person in the room is someone who's already seen the test before. So looking backwards would make it very easy to understand it. But
No.
here,
As a faculty member, the smartest person in the room is usually the faculty member who designs the exam.
well, you saw the test. That means you saw it. That was all inclusive. There was a point. But within this chapter, you talk about Ding, and I thought that this was a fascinating part of the chapter, and I guess a complex explanation. Can you speak on that for a second?
Oh, Ding. And I'm saying, I'm again, my Chinese pronunciation is bad. So again, for Chinese speakers, please forgive me. It's like speaking French to French speakers. I can hear them kind of going, oh no, he's mangling the language. But Ding, the cauldron. And what I did was I looked at, there's really two strains that, there are a number of strains that I discuss in the chapter, you all have to buy the book, but two that we can talk about in this just very brief discussion. One of them was, again, this patriotic campaign, but the other was the notion of Dǐng, that is, of the cauldron, and of its metaphor, that is its allusion to the state, and to a particular conception of the state, strong, a vessel, a pot, a sacrificial pot, an offering pot, into which things are placed for the kind of stability necessary in order for the state to produce a kind of ordered structure from which prosperity, right? The prosperity of the people can then be augmented. And so I played with the notion of Dǐng. It's a complex character in Chinese, and there are a number of sub characters. I love, my Chinese writing is only slightly better than my Chinese speaking, which is like 0. And one of the characters I like to practice with, and still fairly badly, is Dǐng. There's a lot in there, and like you said, and a lot of it is sort of subtle as well. And so I played with the question of Hong Kong as the cauldron, as the symbol of authority, as the space within which authority is exercised, as the structure within which it can be rationalized and made positive for the people. And then in a cauldron, there are things that fall within the cauldron, and then there are things that either spill out or are not part of the cauldron. And that will take us back eventually to the notions of what becomes the Great Patriotic Campaign, and the discussion of, are you, again, interestingly, going back to Professor Shen just obliquely, right? Are you a citizen? Are you a Hong Konger, or are you not? And then, and I know we talked about this before, tying that back up ultimately to the notion of the domestic and the foreign, right? The indigenous and the forces that may be coming outside, and then the question of the helpfulness of the materials that are coming from the outside, or corruptive effect, all of which we're going to be discussing in later chapters, because this stuff does come up in the course of the protest. But we'll take a look at this later on over the course of the chapters. But I did want to plug your question, which came before we started, but actually a quite good one for figuring out how all of this is going to fit in.
Well, I wonder how we were able to point to that, seeing that we've read the book a couple times. And you wrote the book, so you wrote the test. So I guess you're the smartest man in this interview.
Well, only to the extent that I kind of know what I wrote.
Well, I'm glad you know what you wrote, and I hope that everybody who's been listening to these interviews knows what you wrote in the future, or will read what you wrote. And I'd like to thank you again for sitting down with me and discussing chapter 13. Do you have a message to your fans again?
No, only one last little point with respect to this chapter.
Okay.
That is, we're going to spend a lot of time as the book goes on looking at the Chinese Leninist notions of, it's the Maoist notion of fundamental contradictions. We're in a new era of fundamental contradictions now, which is the disparity in the benefits of socialist modernization. But in this essay, we can talk about another contradiction within the specific context of Hong Kong, and that is a fundamental contradiction of disorder and of social harmony, right? And the way in which one bridges that becomes a central issue, the contradiction that has to be overcome to the problem that Hong Kong becomes by the end of August 2019. And so I'll leave you with that. We've got a lot more chapters coming up. It's a great essay that I engage with. I recommend, for those of you who haven't read it, I recommend you reading it, as well as my engagement. To some extent, you may or may not agree with it, but it's worth considering. And I look forward to our next conversation.
That sounds good. Perfect. I cannot wait for the next one as well.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. You have a nice day.